Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates. Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 7th of Jan 2022 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today have been presented on your screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin our today's discussion. The first article for today's analysis appears on page number 7 in the form of an interview. The article is titled as Is it right to increase the age of marriage of women to 21? The article that we are going to discuss here shall become important from the perspective of GS paper 2 polity and governance as well as from the perspective of social issues. Now before discussing various aspects related to this particular article, let me first give you the background. See, presently, with respect to legal framework for age of marriage, we have different laws in place. These laws are the Prevention of Child Marriage Act 2006, Hindu Marriage Act, Christian Marriage Act 1872, Special Marriage Act 1954, and so on. Presently, these laws as such do not provide for a uniform age of marriage for girls and boys. The minimum age of marriage for girls, it is 18 years, and for boys it is 21 years. So this is the present status. So recently the government of India has introduced the Prohibition of Child Marriage Amendment Bill 2021 before the Indian Parliament. This particular bill has been formulated based upon the recommendations of the Jaya Jaitley Committee. This bill seeks to increase the age of marriage for girls to 21, which means that this bill seeks to provide for the uniform age of marriage for both boys and girls in order to bring about gender equality. This bill is set to override the provisions of all other laws and it will be made applicable to all the religions. So this bill would be applicable to all the religions such as Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis and so on. This bill would come into force 2 years after its enactment, which means that this bill would have a cooling off period and it would come into effect 2 years after its enactment. See, the introduction of this particular bill has created intense debate within the parliament, because of which the government has decided to send this particular bill to the scrutiny of the parliamentary standing committee. So with respect to this particular bill, you have certain people who are in favor of increasing the minimum age of marriage for girls, while some people are opposed to the increase in the minimum age. The people who are in support of increasing the minimum age of marriage for girls believe that such an increase in the legal age of marriage would help us address the problem of malnutrition. It will help us reduce the maternal mortality rate, reduce the infant mortality rate, and so on. Apart from that, as we increase the age of marriage for girls, girls as such would have more opportunities in terms of education, in terms of employment. They would have more financial independence, and this will in turn help us promote gender empowerment. Further, there is an important question as to whether the government of India, or for that matter the government of any country, should it interfere in the socio-cultural norms or not. See, normally the government should not interfere in the socio-cultural norms. But what if these socio-cultural norms are going against the interest of a particular section of the society? What if the socio-cultural norms are hampering the growth and development of a particular section? In that case, should the government afford to keep quiet? Obviously not. In such cases, the government of any country should act as an enabler. It should act as a facilitator of social change. So as an enabler and as a facilitator, the government of any country should have to come up with certain progressive laws in order to bring about the change in the society. For example, to counter untouchability, we have come up with the Protection of Civil Rights Act. Similarly, in order to counter the atrocities faced by SCs and STs, we have come up with the Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989 and so on. Similarly, right now, the socio-cultural norms in India encourage the early marriage of the girls. So this particular socio-cultural norms in turn has to be addressed by the government, and that can be addressed by increasing the legal age of marriage for the girls. However, the introduction of this particular bill has been opposed by a number of stakeholders. Now, these stakeholders believe that increasing the age of marriage for girls would have a minimal impact on addressing the problem of malnutrition, reducing the maternal mortality rate. By introducing such a law, the government would be unnecessarily interfering with the socio-cultural norms. And some of the stakeholders have also highlighted that probably this is the first step towards the introduction of the Uniform Civil Code, which has so far been opposed by various religious minorities. So as you can see here, the introduction of this particular bill has led to the political polarization within the Indian society. So with respect to this particular article, you should know various aspects such as the extent of child marriages in India, why the government wants to increase the legal age of marriage for girls, why it has been opposed, and what should be the way ahead. Now, based upon our discussion, you should be in a position to write an answer to these two main questions for practice. The first question here is, what are the reasons for the child marriages in India? Do you think increase in legal age of marriage for girls would put an end to the child marriages? Justify. The second question is, increase in the legal age of marriage for girls is a step in the right direction. However, such a law alone is not sufficient for women empowerment. So let us start our discussion and understand various aspects related to this particular article. In order to understand the extent of child marriages in India, we would have to look at a concept known as the child marriage prevalence. The child marriage prevalence is calculated as the percentage of women in the age group 20 to 24 years who were married before the age of 18. According to National Family Health Survey, India accounts for almost around 40% of the world's child marriages. And as per the National Family Health Survey 5, the child marriage prevalence in India is as high as around 23%. This means that almost 23% of the women in the age group 20 to 24 years, they get married before the age of 18. And India presently has almost around 24 million child brides. As far as the trends in the child marriages is concerned, there has been decline in the child marriages in the last 15 years. But this particular decline is quite marginal and it is hardly around 11% in the last 15 years. As far as the reasons for the child marriages are concerned, there are a number of economic and socio-cultural reasons which have led to the increase in child marriages. For example, the first and foremost reason is poverty. See, even today, almost around 22% of India's population, they live below poverty line. And for these poor people, because of the patriarchal norms, they consider sons as an assets, whereas they consider daughters as liabilities. So because they consider sons as assets, the families spend money on educating the sons, they spend money on skilling the sons, and so on. But as far as daughters are concerned, since they are considered as liabilities, they do not spend money on their education, they do not spend money on providing them with the necessary skill set. And these daughters, as such, would have to be given away in marriage to other families. And because of the socio-cultural norms, the poor families give substantial amount of dowry in marriage. So on account of these socio-cultural norms, on account of these economic reasons, poor families normally decide to get their daughters married before the age of 18. Apart from that, the girls in case of India, they face substantial amount of insecurity. For example, the girls face the problem of sexual harassment. They face the problem of eve teasing, because of which the families, they are basically in a hurry to get the girls married once they attain the puberty. Further, in the recent times, there has been increase in the enrollment in the secondary schools. However, the problem here is a large number of girls are dropping out from the secondary schools because of lack of infrastructural facilities such as toilets in the secondary schools. So the higher dropout rates among the girls at the secondary school level has also led to the increase in the child marriages. So as you can see, there are a number of socio-cultural as well as economic reasons which have contributed to the increase in the child marriages in India. So in order to put an end to the child marriages, the government of India has decided to increase the legal age of marriage for girls from present 18 years to 21 years. So let us understand as to how this increase in the legal age would benefit us. First and foremost, See, in case of India, if you look at the malnutrition, it has been highlighted that the malnutrition in case of India starts in the uterus and it ends in the uterus, which basically means that the malnutrition is on account of the poor nutritional status of the adolescent girls in the age group 11 to 18. See, most of the adolescent girls in the age group of 11 to 18, they are malnourished. They do not have proper nutrition. They normally suffer from iron and folic acid deficiency. So these adolescent girls below the age of 18, when they get married, obviously they would give birth to the undernourished children. That is why it is said that the malnourishment in case of India starts in the uterus and ends in the uterus. So by increasing the legal age of marriage for girls from 18 to 21, we would be able to prevent the marriage of adolescent girls, and by doing that, we would be able to increase the nutrition status of the children born in India. This is the first benefit. Secondly, a large number of women below the age of 18, they get pregnant. And when they get pregnant, usually their body as such would not be in a position to support the birth of children. Under the circumstances, usually there would be a high chance of the death of the mother or the death of an infant. So by increasing the legal age of marriage for girls from 18 to 21, we would be able to prevent the marriage of the adolescent girls, and this will in turn help us bring down the maternal mortality rate and the infant mortality rate. See, the maternal mortality rate right now in case of India in the year 2018-19, this was around 113 per 1 lakh live births, and infant mortality rate was around 35. As per the Sustainable Development Target, India has a target to reduce the maternal mortality rate to 70 per 1 lakh live births. So increasing the legal age for marriage for girls would help us meet the Sustainable Development Goal related to the maternal mortality rate. Thirdly, see, presently if you look at the labor force participation rate in case of India, it is around 50%. This basically means that almost 50% of India's population in the working age group of 20 to 59, they are either working or looking out for work. But there is huge disparity between the male labor force participation rate and the female labor force participation rate. The male labor force participation rate is as high as around 75%, whereas the female labor force participation rate is only around 25%. It means that only 25% of the females in the age group 20 to 59, they are either working or looking out for work. And this female labor force participation rate has continuously declined. In 1990s, the female labor force participation rate was as high as around 45%, but in the year 2017-18, it has dropped down to 25%. See, one of the reasons for the declining female labor force participation rate is on account of the child marriages. That is, when the girls get married before the age of 18, there is less scope for the girl child to get involved in productive activities. Hence, it is expected that when we increase the legal age of marriage for girls from 18 to 21, automatically this can act as an incentive for the families. So the families may be incentivized to provide for the higher education to the girl child. They may spend money on providing the necessary skill set to the girl child, and more number of females can enter the labor force of the Indian economy. In fact, according to World Economic Forum, if the labor force participation rate of the females, that is presently it is 25%, if this increases to match up to the male labor force participation rate of 75%, then the GDP of India could increase by 27%. Nextly, Article 15 of the Indian Constitution provides that the state should not discriminate between the citizens on the grounds of religion, race, caste, and most importantly, sex. Presently, if you look at the legal framework with respect to marriages, we have the different minimum age for boys and a different minimum age for girls. For boys, it is 21 years, and for girls, it is 18 years. So, this in a way is a kind of discrimination against the girls. Hence, by providing for a uniform minimum age for both boys as well as girls with respect to marriage, we would be able to strengthen Article 15 and promote gender equality. The next aspect is with respect to population control. So when more number of girl children are married before the age of 18, these girl children will give birth to more number of children. So the fertility rate would be higher. So the higher fertility rate would translate into higher population growth rate. So in order to reduce the population growth rate and to reduce the fertility rate, we would have to discourage the child marriages. So increasing the legal age of marriage for girls from present 18 to 21 years will help us to bring down the fertility rate and hence help us control the population growth rate. The next aspect is with respect to challenging the patriarchal norms. As I said, if there are certain socio-cultural norms persisting in a society, and if these socio-cultural norms are going against the interests of a particular section, if they are hindering the development, then the government cannot afford to keep quiet. In fact, if the government keeps quiet, then the social inequality, the social discrimination would further accentuate. In such cases, the government of any country would have to act as an enabler, it has to act as a facilitator and bring about social change and development. And one way of doing this is by increasing the legal age of marriage for girls. And lastly, presently, if you look at India's ranking on various global indices such as the Global Gender Gap Report, Gender Inequality Index, etc., is quite poor. So it is expected that by increasing the legal age for marriage for girls, we would be able to improve their health outcomes, we would be able to improve their educational outcomes, promote more financial independence among the girls, and overall it can lead to gender empowerment. Please do let us know in the comment section as to which agency publishes the Global Gender Gap Report and which agency publishes the Gender Inequality Index. Now coming to the second aspect of the debate, that is the reasons for the opposition to increasing the minimum age of marriage. First and foremost, some of the stakeholders have highlighted that even if we increase the minimum age for marriage, we would not be able to address the problem of malnutrition. We would not be able to reduce MMR and IMR. So let's try to understand their point of view. See, we have discussed that one of the reasons for the malnutrition is on account of the poor nutrition status of the adolescent girls. So when the nutrition status of the adolescent girls is quite poor, they normally give birth to the children who are malnourished. This is one aspect which we have discussed. Secondly, we have also discussed that when the adolescent girls become pregnant and when they give birth, there are higher chances of the death of the mother or the death of the children, which normally leads to higher MMR and IMR. Now, some of the stakeholders believe that even if we increase the age of marriage for the girls, we would not be able to solve this problem of malnutrition, MMR and IMR. Why is that? Now let's say we have increased the minimum age of marriage from 18 to 21. So earlier, let's say a particular girl child was getting married at the age of 19. But now the same girl child will probably get married at the age of 22. So now what we are saying is when this girl child gets married at the age of 19, this will lead to problem of malnutrition. There could be higher chances of MMR, there could be higher chances of IMR. So far so good. But when the same girl child gets married at the age of 22, then there will be less chances of malnutrition, less chances of MMR, less chances of IMR. Now this is true only to a certain extent. This is so because whether this 22-year girl child, whether she will be malnourished or not, this in turn depends upon the socio-cultural and economic factors. For example, if the family is extremely poor, such a family will not be able to provide for the adequate nutrition to the girl child. So irrespective whether the girl child is 19 years or 22 years old, such a girl child will obviously be malnourished. Secondly, the kind of society which we are living in, it is highly patriarchal, because of which there is a gender discrimination against a girl child. So because of the gender discrimination, normally the girl children are not properly fed. They're not given proper nutrition. So once again, whether a girl child is 19 years or 22 years, still a girl child will continue to be malnourished. Nextly, some stakeholders have also highlighted that increase in the minimum age would have a limited impact. In order to understand their point of view, we would have to look at the Prohibition of Child Marriage Act 2006. Now this particular act seeks to put an end to the child marriages wherein it prevents the marriage of girl child below the age of 18. In spite of the fact that we have a law in place, even today, as we have seen earlier, Almost around 23% of the women have got married before the age of 18. Now, this clearly shows that law on its own will not be able to prevent the marriage of the girl child below the age of 21. So, just having a law in place and increasing the minimum age to 21 years will not have an impact unless we improve the overall implementation of the law. So, as long as we don't implement the law properly, the law will have a limited impact. So, that's the first aspect. Secondly, see, as far as the child marriages are concerned, there are a number of socio-cultural and economic reasons for the child marriages. And these reasons include poverty, patriarchal norms, insecurity, higher dropout rates in the secondary schools, and so on. Are we addressing the core reasons for the child marriages in India? No. So we are just putting a legal framework. So a legal framework on its own may not be sufficient in order to prevent the child marriages. That is why the stakeholders have highlighted that even if we increase the minimum age for girls, it could have a limited impact. And this limited impact is on account of poor implementation and the fact that we are not addressing the core problems which have led to the child marriages. Thirdly, one of the arguments put forward for increasing the minimum age for girls was that by increasing the minimum age, we would be able to control the population growth rate. But most of you must be knowing about the recent highlights of the National Family Health Survey 5 report. According to this particular report, already the fertility rate at all India level has reduced to 2 and it is below the replacement level fertility of 2.1, which means that we are not facing the problem of population explosion. Rather, the population in case of India is going to get stabilized in the next 2 decades. So this particular argument that the increase in the legal age for marriage would help us control the population is no longer valid. The next aspect is with respect to interference in the social customs. So some of the religious minorities have highlighted that by increasing the legal age for marriage, the government is unnecessarily interfering in the socio-cultural norms, and this is considered to be a first step towards a uniform civil code, which for long has been opposed by the religious minorities. Nextly, some of the stakeholders have also highlighted that this is an illogical step. This is so because a 18 years old girl can vote in case of India. She can give consent for sex, but she cannot marry. Now this seems quite illogical because on one hand, a girl child can vote, she can decide her representatives in the parliament, while on the other hand, she cannot choose whose her life partner can be. And lastly, see, if you look at India's previous experiences of bringing about change in the behavior of the society or a social change, India has been quite successful in bringing about a social change or a behavior in the society through awareness rather than through coercive laws. The best example happens to be the family planning programs in India. See, as far as the family planning programs is concerned, we did not come up with any kind of coercive laws. Rather, we increase the awareness among the people to have less number of children. So we came up with a slogan of Hum Do Hamare Do. This particular slogan was repeatedly reinforced in the minds of the people. And over a period of time, because of the repeated reinforcement of this concept of Hum Do Hamare Do, now the families as such have automatically adopted the concept of the 2 children. Similarly, some of the stakeholders have highlighted that if you want to bring about a social change in terms of minimum age of marriage for girls, this has to be brought about through increased awareness among the people rather than through coercive laws. So having understood both the sides of the coin, let us now look at the way ahead as to what should India do. Now it is being said that coming up with a law to increase the age of marriage for girls is undoubtedly a step in the right direction. But at the same time, we must understand that gender empowerment as such is a concept which is multifaceted in nature. If we want to bring about gender empowerment, we cannot depend upon the legal framework alone. Apart from the legal framework, we would have to create a conducive ecosystem to empower the women. So apart from the law, to increase the minimum age for girls from 18 to 21, we would have to create certain conducive ecosystem. For example, we would have to improve the health outcomes of the adolescent girls in the age group 11 to 18 by providing them with iron and folic acid supplements. We must promote awareness about the ill effects of the early child marriage within the poor families. We must provide for the conditional cash transfer in order to improve the attendance of girls in the schools, also provide them with the necessary training for improving their skill set. We must provide adequate employment opportunities to the females to increase their female labor force participation rate. And lastly, we must ensure a safe environment to the women and protect them from the constant threat of rape and sexual assault. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know as far as this particular article is concerned. So based upon this particular analysis, please try to write answers to these two main questions for the practice. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 6 in a form of an editorial. The article is titled as No Room for Complacency. This article shall be important mainly with respect to prelims under the subsection of Science and Technology. See, recently India has reported more than 1 lakh COVID-19 cases in a single day. It is considered to be the highest single day spike in the last 200 days. Last time, the COVID-19 cases had increased on account of the Delta variant, and this time the COVID-19 cases have increased on account of the Omicron variant. Based upon the preliminary evidences from countries such as South Africa, UK, etc., the Omicron variant is considered to be less deadly but highly transmissible. Now, this particular editorial here highlights that the Omicron variant has become less deadly only because more number of people have got vaccinated. So because of the increase in the vaccination coverage in India, the Omicron as such has become less deadly. So because the people have got vaccinated, the need for hospitalization for the people who have infected with the Omicron variant has got reduced. So this article highlights that we should not be complacent as far as the vaccination is concerned. We must increase the vaccination and at the same time ramp up the testing for the rising COVID-19 cases. See, recently a very important development has taken place with respect to the testing for the Omicron variant of the COVID-19. The Indian Council for Medical Research has recently approved a new testing kit known as Omisure for detecting the Omicron variant of COVID-19. The Omisure testing kit has been developed by Tata Medicals and Diagnostics, and this testing kit in turn relies on a strategy known as the S-gene target failure strategy in order to check for the presence of the Omicron variant. So before discussing various aspects of the S-gene target failure strategy and Omisure, let us first understand as to how does a normal RT-PCR test works. Now when you give a sample for the RT-PCR test, so when you give a sample either from the nose or the mouth, the RT-PCR test in turn checks for the presence of multiple genes associated with the coronavirus. Now if you look at the structure of the coronavirus, on the surface of the coronavirus you have the spike proteins. And as you know, these spike proteins in turn help the coronavirus to bind with the human cells, and it is through these spike proteins the coronavirus in turn injects its genetic material into human cells. Now these spike proteins as such, they are in turn made of different genes. Now some of the genes which are found on the coronavirus include the genes such as N gene, E gene, S gene, ORF gene and so on. So the RT-PCR test in turn checks for the presence of these genes in the sample which you have provided. So if the sample consists of any of these genes, then automatically a person is declared to be COVID positive. So the sample can have a N gene, or it could have a E gene or a S gene or an ORF gene. So basically we are testing for the presence of multiple genes in the sample, and if these genes are present, then we declare a particular person to be COVID-19. Now the problem in this RT-PCR test is it is difficult to know whether a person is infected with the Delta variant of COVID-19, whether he is infected with the Omicron variant or any other variant of COVID-19. So we'll just get to know that the person is infected with COVID-19, but we'll not get to know as to with which variant of COVID-19 such a person has got infected. So in order to understand or to find out as to with which variant a person has got infected, we need to go for confirmation. And this confirmation is basically done through the genome sequencing. Now as far as the Omicron is concerned, as I said, the Omicron is considered to be highly transmissible. So since the Omicron is highly transmissible, there is a need for the faster detection of the Omicron variants through some proxy testing methods. So these proxy testing methods in turn rely on the genetic mutations which the Omicron variant has undergone. Now we all know that the Omicron variant has undergone more than 50 genetic mutations. Now, in spite of the genetic mutations which the Omicron variant has undergone, the Omicron variant still has the basic genes which are associated with the COVID-19. The Omicron has the N gene, E gene, ORF genes, and so on. However, the Omicron variant as such does not has the S gene. So the S gene is absent in the Omicron variant. So while Omicron has all the genes which are associated with the coronavirus, but the Omicron as such does not has a S gene. So we can check for the presence of S gene in a sample to know whether a person is infected with the Omicron variant or not. And this particular strategy is referred to as the S gene target failure strategy. Now this particular strategy has been used in the Omisure testing kit which has been developed by Tata Medicals and Diagnostics. So under this particular strategy, what we do here is we check for the presence of S gene in the sample. So if the S gene is present in the sample, then it obviously means that a person is infected with the COVID-19, but such a person is not infected with the Omicron variant. Such a person may be infected with some other variant of COVID-19. On the other hand, if the S gene is absent, but if other genes are present, such as N, E, ORF, etc., then it means that such a person is obviously COVID positive and he is infected with the Omicron variant. Now you must understand that the testing to the Omisure kit is basically a proxy testing. Further confirmation as to whether the person is indeed infected with the Omicron variant or not has to be confirmed through the genome testing. Now, this is what you must understand from the perspective of this particular article. Now, this particular article appears on page number 6. The article is titled as Extinguishing the Tobacco Industry's Main Narrative. This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 2, Polity and Governance. Now, before discussing various aspects related to this particular article, let me first give you the background. See, in our DNS dated 9th of December 2021, we had carried out a critical analysis of the government's taxation policy on tobacco products. In this particular DNS, we had discussed that presently India is the second largest consumer of tobacco. And the higher consumption of tobacco has in turn led to both adverse health implications as well as the economic implications. Hence, the National Health Policy 2017 has sought to reduce the prevalence of tobacco usage by 15% by the end of 2020 and by additional 15% by the end of 2030. That is, by the end of 2030, we should be able to reduce the prevalence of tobacco usage by 30%. The National Health Policy 2017 seeks to use tax as a tool to discourage the use of tobacco. So it is expected that as we increase the tax rates on various tobacco related products, the tobacco related products will become more costly, and this will in turn discourage the people from consuming more tobacco. So presently, if you look at the present taxation policy on tobacco, on various tobacco related products such as pan masala, BDs, cigarettes, etc., we impose multiple taxes which include the excise duty, GST, GST compensation cess, national calamity contingency duty, and so on. So presently, the tax burden on cigarettes is around 52%, on BDs it is 22%, and on pan masala it is around 64%. In spite of imposing multiple taxes on various tobacco related products, the present tax burden on tobacco products, even today, it is much lower than the WHO's recommendations. According to World Health Organization, the minimum tax burden on various tobacco products should be around 75%. But presently, as you can see, the tax burden on various tobacco products is below 75%. Apart from that, since the year 2017, the government has increased the tax on various tobacco related products by only 5%. Hence, in order to discourage the people from using tobacco, the government of India has appointed a committee under the leadership of Vikas Sheel. the Vikashsheel Committee is expected to come out with a comprehensive tax policy on tobacco. The recommendations of this particular committee is expected to be incorporated in this year's union budget. So the overall background to this particular story here is the government is expected to increase the tax rates on various tobacco related products. However, various tobacco manufacturing companies are opposed to this particular increase in the tax rates. In this regard, this particular article here discusses as to what reasons the tobacco manufacturing companies are giving for not increasing the tax rates and why these reasons as such are flawed. So, from the perspective of the examination, there should be two things that you should know with respect to this particular topic. One, what are the arguments in favor for increasing the tax rates on tobacco products and why the higher tax rates are opposed by the tobacco manufacturing companies. As far as the arguments in favor is concerned, first and foremost, by increasing the tax rates on tobacco products, we will be able to align the tax rates with the WHO's recommendations of minimum 75% tax burden on the tobacco products. So this is the first benefit. Secondly, we will be able to improve the health outcomes. We would be able to prevent the tobacco companies from making windfall profits, and it will also benefit the government, wherein the economic burden on the government because of higher consumption of tobacco, this will get reduced, and the government tax to GDP ratio would also increase. So overall, there are a number of benefits with respect to increasing the tax rates on the tobacco products. However, the same has been opposed by the tobacco companies. The basic opposition of the tobacco companies is that if we increase the tax rates on the tobacco products, then this could lead to an increase in the illicit sale of cigarettes. So basic argument here is if we increase the tax rates on cigarettes, for example, rather than selling cigarettes through formal channels, cigarettes may be sold through informal channels in order to evade payment of taxes. For example, according to the Tobacco Institute of India, there is a higher illicit sale of cigarettes, and this is as high as around 25%, which means that out of every 100 cigarettes sold in India, only 75% of the cigarettes are sold through formal channels, and remaining 25% of the cigarettes are sold through the informal channels. And the Tobacco Institute of India believes that if we increase the tax rates on cigarettes, then the amount of cigarettes or the percentage of cigarettes sold through the informal channels would further increase. And if more number of cigarettes are sold through informal channels, this will lead to loss of tax revenue to the government, and the government will not be able to effectively regulate the sale of cigarettes in the Indian economy. So this is an argument which has been put forth by the tobacco companies. Against this particular argument, the article here has raised a number of concerns and challenges. First and foremost, the article has highlighted that as of now, there is no relationship as such between the tax rates and the illicit sale of cigarettes. See, as far as the tobacco companies are concerned, they believe that if we increase the tax rates on tobacco products, automatically it will lead to increase in the illicit sale of cigarettes. However, this particular article highlights that as such, there is no relationship between the tax rates and the illicit sale of cigarettes. In order to substantiate its points, the article has taken certain facts and figures which are based upon certain empirical studies. Now, according to these studies, as of now, the illicit sale of cigarettes ranges from around 2% to only around 6.5%. On the other hand, the tobacco companies believe that the illicit sale of cigarettes is much higher at around 25%. So the article highlights that the tobacco companies as such are deliberately exaggerating the extent and intensity of the illicit sale of cigarettes. Apart from the empirical evidences, the article has also taken support of the taxation policies in other countries. The article has highlighted that in some countries where the tax rates are much higher, in those countries, the illicit sale of cigarettes is much lower. Apart from that, in some countries where the tax rates are lower, in spite of the lower tax rates, the illicit sale of cigarettes is much higher. Now, this clearly goes on to show that there is no relationship as such between the tax rates and the illicit sale of cigarettes. In fact, the illicit sale of cigarettes is independently based upon a number of factors such as the efficiency of tax administration, the efficiency of the regulatory framework, the government's commitment to crack down on illicit sale of cigarettes, and so on. So clearly the article here establishes a very important aspect that there is no relationship between the tax rates and the illicit sale of cigarettes. So the arguments put forth by the tobacco companies that the increase in tax rates would lead to a higher sale of illicit cigarettes. Now this is clearly wrong as per this particular article. So going forward, we need to incorporate the recommendations of the Vikas Sheel committee as and when this particular committee submits its recommendations. So hopefully in future, we must come out with a comprehensive policy on tobacco products, and we should increase the tax rates on various tobacco products. Now this would be a win-win situation. On one hand, we would be able to improve the health outcomes in India, while on the other hand, we will also be able to improve the tax to GDP ratio of the Indian economy. So these are some important aspects which one should know as far as this particular article is concerned. Now, based upon the discussion of this particular article, let us take up this practice MCQ. So question here is, with respect to National Calamity Contingency Duty, consider the following statements. Now the National Calamity Contingency Duty we have already discussed in our DNS dated 9th of December 2021. So the first statement here is, the National Calamity Contingency Duty is imposed on certain specified tobacco products and crude petroleum. The statement which is given here, as we discussed, is correct. The second statement is, the proceeds of the National Calamity Contingency Duty is used to fund both National Disaster Response Fund and the State Disaster Response Fund. The statement is wrong here because the proceeds of the National Calamity Contingency Duty is used to fund only the NDRF and not the SDRF. So the right answer to this particular question would be A, that is 1 only. Apart from that, recently in December 2021, a particular country has made a historic decision to completely ban the sale of cigarettes to its future generations. So please do let us know in the comment section as to which country has made such a historic decision. The next article appears on page number 10. The article is titled as Expenditure Limit for Lok Sabha and Assembly Candidates Hiked. This particular article becomes important from the perspective of prelims under the subsection of polity and governance. See, when candidates are contesting for the Lok Sabha elections or the state assembly elections, these candidates as such belong to different socio-economic backgrounds. Some candidates might be extremely rich, while some candidates might be quite poor. Now the candidates who are extremely rich, they can spend substantial amount of money on campaigning of elections. Whereas the poor candidates, they may not be in a position to spend more amount of money. So this kind of socio-economic disparity between the candidates who are contesting the elections creates a lack of level playing field. Hence, in order to create a level playing field, there is a need to put a limit on how much money can be spent by the individual candidates while contesting the elections. And that is what precisely Section 77 of the Representation of Peoples Act 1951 does. So this particular section provides that when any candidate is contesting for a Lok Sabha election or a state assembly election, such a candidate should maintain a separate account. So whatever money he is spending on campaigning of elections, be it on social media campaigns, be it on the movement of vehicles and so on, all that money should be compulsorily spent from this particular separate account. Apart from this, the section 77 also lays down that the necessary limit on expenditure should have to be prescribed under the conduct of election rules. So as of now, we have put a limit on how much money can an individual candidate spend on the parliamentary elections and the state assembly elections. So as you can see, we have a different limit for the parliamentary constituencies and the assembly constituencies. And even within the parliamentary constituencies, we have a separate limit for the bigger states and the smaller states. The same thing is applicable even for the assembly constituencies. So as you can see, in the bigger states, an individual candidate who is contesting for a MP seat, such a candidate cannot spend more than 70 lakhs. In the smaller states, he cannot spend more than 54 lakhs. Now, this particular limit was set in the year 2014. Similarly, if a candidate is contesting an election as an MLA, such a candidate cannot spend more than 28 lakhs in a big state and he cannot spend more than 20 lakhs in a smaller state. Now, recently, the Election Commission of India has decided to increase the limit on the expenditure. And as you can see, as far as the parliamentary constituencies is concerned, it has been increased to 95 lakhs in case of bigger states, whereas in the smaller states, it has been increased from 54 lakhs to 75 lakhs. As far as the assembly constituencies is concerned, it has been increased from 28 lakhs to 40 lakhs and from 20 lakhs in the smaller states to 28 lakhs. In its statement, the Election Commission of India has given some reasons for increasing the expenditure limit. First and foremost, it has highlighted that there has been increase in the number of electors since the year 2014. That is one of the reasons as to why they have decided to increase the expenditure limit. Secondly, there has been increase in the prices of the goods and services. So accordingly, this factor of inflation has been taken into account. And lastly, the individual candidates these days, they also rely on the social media campaign. So apart from carrying out physical campaigning, they also rely on social media campaign. So the amount of money which they are required to spend is more, and that is why they have decided to increase the expenditure limit. So this is what you must understand from this particular article. But let us look into this prelims based MCQ and understand more about the expenditure limit for the elections. The prelims MCQ here is: consider the following statements related to the limit on the election expenditure by the political parties and the individual candidates. The first statement here is: Representation of People Act 1951 lays down a limit on the expenditure incurred by both the political parties and individual candidates in the constituencies. Now, please understand here that we are putting a limit only on the expenditure which is incurred by the individual candidates in the constituencies. As such, there is no limit on the expenditure which can be incurred by the political parties. So, the statement which is given here is wrong. The second statement is: there is a uniform limit on the expenditure for elections to both Lok Sabha and State Legislative Assembly. As I discussed before, even this particular statement is wrong. Accordingly, the right answer to this particular question would be D. That is neither one nor two. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article appears on page number 1. The article is titled as Russia-led troops deployed in Kazakhstan. This article becomes important mainly with respect to prelims from the perspective of international relations. So if you look at Kazakhstan, it is considered to be one of the most peaceful and stable country in the Central Asian region. However, in the last few days, Kazakhstan has been rocked by a large-scale protest. In the recent days, there has been sharp and sudden spike in the fuel prices, and this in turn has triggered large-scale protests across Kazakhstan. So far, these protests were brought under control by the Kazakh security forces. The Kazakh security forces had cracked down on these protesters, leading to a death of a dozen protesters. So this has further accentuated or aggravated the protests in Kazakhstan. Hence, in order to restore peace and stability and to restore law and order, a military alliance led by Russia, known as the Collective Security Treaty Organization, has sent troops to Kazakhstan. In this regard, let us look into two important aspects, that is the map of Central Asia, and second one is some important details about the Collective Security Treaty Organization from the perspective of the prelims examination. So this is the map of Central Asia, and as you can see here, you have the Aral Sea, and Aral Sea is spread across two countries, that is Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Apart from that, please look at this Caspian Sea and look at the countries which are surrounding this Caspian Sea. First and foremost, you have Kazakhstan, then you have Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Russia. Now, these aspects could become important from the perspective of your prelims examination. Now, coming to the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Now, this particular organization is basically an intergovernmental military alliance in the Eurasian region and is basically comprised of the countries which are previously part of the Soviet Union. It came into being in the year 2002 through a treaty known as the Tashkent Treaty. In the present day, this particular organization has basically 6 members, which include Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. There are multiple agendas of this particular organization. First and foremost, it provides for a collective rapid action force in order to restore law and order in the member states. So when any member states faces the problem of law and order, this particular organization sends its troops there, and that is what precisely this organization has done now in the context of Kazakhstan. It also provides for counter-terrorism exercises in the Central Asian region, and it also provides for the peacekeeping forces. So these are some of the important things which you must know from the perspective of the prelims examination from this particular topic. With this, we have come to the end of today's discussion. Let us now have a look at the question for the day. The answer to the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS is option C.